The first time I realized my new neighbor had built part of his garage over my driveway, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A few months later, that same garage would become almost completely useless, and the guy who spent weeks telling me I was overreacting would be standing on my porch asking for help. Looking back now, the craziest part isn't that he crossed the property line. It's that I gave him every opportunity to fix it before I decided to stop being the nice neighbor. My name is Caleb Turner, and for nearly 10 years I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Fort Wayne, Indiana. It wasn't the kind of place where people argued over property lines or called the city every time someone parked too close to a mailbox. Most of us knew each other. We'd wave from across the street, talk about the weather, complain about rising property taxes, then go back to our lives. I liked it that way. My house sat on a corner lot with a long gravel driveway running down the side of the property toward a detached garage in the backyard. That driveway was one of the reasons I bought the place in the first place. It gave me room for trailers, project vehicles, deliveries, and all the random home improvement projects that seem to multiply once you become a homeowner. The previous neighbor, an older man named Walter, had lived next door almost as long as I'd lived there. We got along great. Years earlier, he'd even paid for a survey before replacing a fence, so both of us knew exactly where the property line sat. There was never any confusion, never any drama. Then Walter retired and moved closer to his grandchildren. A few weeks later, the house sold. That's when Mason and Rachel Crawford moved in. At first, they seemed friendly enough. Mason was outgoing, confident, the kind of guy who always talked like he was pitching an investment opportunity. Rachel was quieter, polite whenever we spoke, but mostly stayed in the background. During their first month in the neighborhood, they seemed determined to upgrade everything. Landscaping crews appeared. Contractors came and went. New fencing was installed. Trees were removed. Fresh concrete was poured. Every weekend looked like an episode of a home renovation show. Honestly, I didn't care. People can spend their money however they want. The trouble started when they decided to build a second garage behind their house. I first noticed the construction markers one Saturday morning while mowing my lawn. A few days later, equipment arrived. Then came the concrete forms. Then the framing. At first, it looked like a normal project. But as the structure started taking shape, something kept bothering me. Every time I glanced toward it, the garage seemed unusually close to my driveway. I couldn't explain exactly why. It was just one of those instincts you get after living somewhere for years. Something felt off. Still, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Professional builders know what they're doing, right? Surveyors exist for a reason. Permits exist for a reason. Surely nobody would spend tens of thousands of dollars building a structure without knowing where their property ended. So I ignored the feeling and went about my life. Then one morning, everything changed. I was backing my SUV out of the driveway before work when I glanced into my side mirror and immediately hit the brakes. Hard. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. I put the vehicle in park, got out, and walked down the driveway. The closer I got, the worse it looked. The roof of the new garage wasn't simply near my property. It was extending over it. I stopped halfway down the driveway and stared upward. The corner of the roof projected directly above land that belonged to me. Not by a couple inches. Not by some barely noticeable amount. By several feet. I remember standing there in complete silence, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe the angle was misleading. Maybe I was looking at it wrong. Maybe there was some easement I'd forgotten about. But the more I looked, the more obvious it became. Part of that structure was hanging over my driveway. Later that afternoon, I walked next door to talk about it. Mason was standing outside near the construction crew checking something on his phone. I pointed toward the roof line and said, "Hey, can I ask you something about the new garage?" He looked up. "Sure. Are you positive it's sitting where it's supposed to?" He glanced at the building for less than 2 seconds before shrugging. "Yeah. What?" "Because it looks like part of the roof is crossing over my driveway." He laughed immediately. Not nervous laughter. Not uncertain laughter. Confident laughter. The kind people use when they've already decided your concern doesn't matter. "The contractor measured everything," he said. "Did you have a survey done?" I asked. "The builder handled all that stuff." I looked toward one of the contractors nearby. Funny enough, the guy suddenly found a reason to walk in the opposite direction. That didn't exactly boost my confidence. I looked back at Mason. "You might want to double check." Then he said something that stayed in my head for weeks afterward. "It's only a few feet. You can still get through." I don't know why those words irritated me so much at the time, but they did. Maybe because he wasn't denying the problem. Maybe because he wasn't surprised by it. Maybe because he sounded like someone who had already decided his convenience mattered more than my property rights. I forced a smile, told him we'd talk later, and walked back home. That evening I sat on my back porch long after sunset, staring at the outline of that garage against the darkening sky. The neighborhood was quiet. The construction crew was gone. Everything looked peaceful. But the more I thought about our conversation, the more something bothered me. If Mason had simply apologized and promised to verify the measurements, none of what happened afterward would have happened. Instead, he'd essentially told me that losing part of my property wasn't a big deal because it didn't inconvenience him. And that's when I realized this wasn't really about a garage anymore. It was about respect. The next morning, before I even finished my first cup of coffee, I called a licensed surveyor. Because if there was one thing I had learned in life, it was that opinions start arguments, but measurements end them. And a few days later, those measurements would reveal a problem far bigger than either of us expected. A week later, the surveyor showed up just after sunrise, and from the moment he stepped out of his truck, I could tell he'd seen neighborhood disputes like this 100 times before. He didn't waste time with small talk. He unloaded his equipment, checked the county records I'd gathered, reviewed the original property maps, then started working his way slowly along the edge of my lot. I followed him around for most of the morning pretending I was relaxed, but the truth is I was nervous. There was still a small part of me hoping I'd somehow been wrong. Maybe the roof only looked closer than it really was. Maybe there was some easement I didn't know about. Maybe the whole thing would turn out to be a misunderstanding and we'd all laugh about it later. Around lunchtime, the surveyor motioned me over. He was standing beside a row of bright orange stakes he'd just driven into the ground. I walked over and immediately felt my stomach tighten. The line of stakes ran nowhere near where Trent's garage was sitting. In fact, one entire corner of the structure crossed directly over the surveyed boundary. The surveyor looked at me and shook his head. "You weren't imagining it," he said. "Not even close." Then he showed me the measurements. The corner of the garage extended almost 4 feet beyond the legal line, while part of the roof projected even farther across the airspace above my driveway. I stood there staring at the numbers for several seconds. Even though I'd suspected something was wrong, seeing it confirmed in black and white felt different. Suddenly, this wasn't a disagreement between neighbors anymore. It was documented. It was measurable. It was real. The surveyor handed me a certified copy of the report and said something that stuck with me. Most property disputes aren't really about land. They're about whether people think rules apply to them. Then he packed up his equipment and drove away. I spent the rest of the afternoon taking photographs. Close-ups, wide shots, pictures showing the survey stakes, pictures showing the garage, pictures from angles that clearly demonstrated how much of the structure crossed over my property. By evening, I had an entire folder of evidence. The next morning, I printed copies of everything and placed them in a large envelope. I walked next door, knocked on the door, and handed it directly to Trent. He glanced at the survey, flipped through 2 pages, then shrugged. "What's this supposed to prove?" I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It proves part of your garage is on my property." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, Ryan. I'm serious. It's a few feet." There it was again. Those 3 words. A few feet. Like repeating them enough times somehow changed reality. I pointed toward the driveway. "You built over my access route." He folded the papers and handed them back. "Look, tearing down part of that garage would cost a fortune. You can still get through. I don't see the problem." Then he turned around and walked back inside his house. Just like that. Conversation over. No apology. No negotiation. No concern. I remember standing on his porch holding the survey paperwork while his front door slowly closed in my face. I should have been furious. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because for the first time I understood exactly who I was dealing with. Up until then I thought this might have been a construction mistake. Now I realized it wasn't the garage that was the problem. It was arrogance. Trent genuinely believed that because correcting the mistake would be expensive for him, I should simply accept the consequences. Over the next few days I started noticing how much the encroachment actually affected daily life. A friend brought over a utility trailer and we had trouble maneuvering it into my backyard. A delivery driver nearly clipped part of the overhang, trying to back down the driveway. Even moving larger furniture became more difficult. Every inconvenience reminded me of the same thing. Someone else's decision was limiting how I used property I'd paid for. One evening I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by maps, property records, county regulations, and zoning documents. My sister Emily called while I was reading through a stack of paperwork. After listening to the situation, she asked the obvious question. Why don't you sue him? I laughed. Because lawsuits take forever. Then what are you going to do? I looked down at the documents spread across the table. I don't know yet. But deep down I had a feeling the answer was somewhere in those papers. Night after night, I kept researching. Most of the information was painfully boring, but eventually I found something interesting. Very interesting. The driveway wasn't part of any shared access agreement. There were no easements benefiting the neighboring property. There were no restrictions preventing me from installing protective structures designed to control vehicle access to my own garage, provided everything remained within code requirements. I read the section 3 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Then I contacted a local property attorney and paid for a consultation. He reviewed the survey, reviewed the regulations, then leaned back in his chair and smiled. You're not asking the right question, he said. What do you mean? You keep asking how to force him to fix the garage. Isn't that the issue? He shook his head. No, the issue is protecting your property rights. I sat there quietly for a moment. Then it clicked. The attorney wasn't telling me to retaliate. He wasn't suggesting some elaborate legal trap. He was reminding me that I already had rights. I just needed to use them. The idea came to me on the drive home. At first it seemed almost too simple. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was smiling. By the next morning I was making phone calls. A week later, I met with a local metal fabrication company. The owner was a guy named Vince who looked like he could build a battleship out of scrap metal and spare parts. I showed him the survey. I explained the garage. I explained the overhang. Halfway through my story, he started grinning. By the time I finished, he was trying not to laugh. You want a clearance bar? He asked. Exactly. That's cold. It's legal. That it is. Over the next several days, we finalized the design. 2 heavy steel posts. Reinforced concrete footings. 1 solid crossbar positioned at a precise height. Not low enough to interfere with normal access to my garage. Just high enough to protect my driveway exactly as intended. The installation date arrived on a bright Saturday morning. 3 trucks rolled into my driveway shortly after breakfast. Workers unloaded steel beams, concrete bags, welding equipment, and construction tools. The noise attracted attention immediately. Curtains moved throughout the neighborhood. Front doors opened. People suddenly discovered they needed to water plants and collect mail. And right on schedule, Trent came outside. He walked across his lawn looking annoyed. What's going on? He asked. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. Property improvement project. He looked at the steel posts, then at the crew, then back at me. What kind of project? Before I could answer, the workers started digging 2 deep holes at the entrance to my driveway. For the first time since we'd met, I saw genuine uncertainty on his face. And I have to admit, after everything that had happened, that felt pretty satisfying. By the following Monday, the entire neighborhood knew something was wrong. Word travels fast when a brand new garage suddenly becomes the most expensive storage shed in town. Every day, I watched the situation unfold from my kitchen window. Smaller cars could still squeeze into the garage if the driver was careful, but anything larger became a headache. Pickup trucks struggled with the turning angle. Delivery vans couldn't make it work at all. One landscaping trailer nearly clipped the overhang during an attempt to back in. Every failed maneuver attracted another audience. Neighbors walking dogs would slow down. People checking their mail would suddenly become fascinated by what was happening. Nobody said much directly, but everyone could see the same thing. Mason had spent a fortune building a garage that no longer functioned the way he intended. The irony was impossible to miss. For weeks he had treated my concerns like an inconvenience. Now he was dealing with the consequences every single day. About 2 weeks after the clearance bar went up, I heard a knock on my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Mason stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets. The confidence that had defined every previous conversation was gone. He looked tired, frustrated, maybe even embarrassed. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Can we talk? I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Sure. He glanced toward the driveway. This situation isn't working. I almost laughed at how different that sounded from. It's only a few feet. Instead I stayed quiet and let him continue. Look, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe things got off on the wrong foot. Maybe. That was certainly one way to describe it. He took a deep breath. What would it take to fix this? There it was. The question I had been waiting months to hear. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to humiliate him. Because for the first time he was finally acknowledging there was a problem. I pointed toward the garage. Move the part that's on my property. His eyes followed my hand. That's expensive. I nodded. So was building it in the wrong place. He looked away for a moment. The silence stretched between us. Then he asked, and if we do that? The clearance bar comes down. He stared at me for several seconds, probably realizing he had reached the exact point I tried to help him avoid months earlier. Back when fixing the mistake would have been easier. Back when a simple conversation could have solved everything. Finally he sighed. All right. A few weeks later contractors returned. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no confident laughs. No dismissive comments. No speeches about a few feet not matching. Survey stakes appeared again. Measurements were checked repeatedly. The affected corner of the garage was modified and rebuilt so it sat entirely within the property line. The overhang was corrected. The encroachment disappeared. Once the work was finished, I kept my word. The clearance bar came down. The driveway returned to normal. The garage finally functioned the way it should have from the beginning. A few days after everything was completed, Mason actually walked over carrying a six-pack of beer. The same way he'd introduced himself when he first moved in. We sat in lawn chairs between our houses as the sun went down. For a while neither of us talked about the dispute. Then he finally shook his head and laughed. You know, he said, I should have listened to you the first time. Probably would have saved you a lot of money. He laughed again. Definitely would have saved me a lot of money. Looking back, I don't really consider what happened revenge. Revenge would have been trying to hurt him. What I did was protect my property using rights I already had. The truth is that property lines aren't just lines on paper. They're agreements. They're boundaries that allow neighbors to live beside each other without constant conflict. The moment one person decides those boundaries don't matter, problems start. Sometimes expensive problems. And honestly, that's the part one still think about. If someone had accidentally crossed onto my property and immediately tried to make it right, I would have worked with them. I would have been patient. I would have helped find a solution. But arrogance has a way of turning small mistakes into major disasters. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I justified in installing the clearance bar on my own property, or should I have handled the situation differently? If you were in my position, would you have gone straight to court, or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought rules only applied to other people, I'd love to hear that story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.